So hello and welcome to this session. My name is Megan Passy from the International Cocoa Initiative, and it's great to have you with us today. I'll be facilitating this afternoon's panel on the theme of child labour severity. Thank you very much for your patience these past few minutes while we tried to deal with some technical difficulties around the interpretation. So I have the honour today to be joined by a really diverse set of panellists. Let me introduce them to you. So first we have Bernard Kofi Mensah. Bernard's a cocoa farmer. He works in the Western North region of Ghana, although today he's joining us from Kumasi. You can raise your hand, Bernard. Then we have Madame Espérance Tano-Épouse-Canon. Madame Canon is a specialized technician working for the National Rural Development Extension Service in Soubré. That's the Agence Nationale d'Appui au Développement Rural, ANADER, en Côte d'Ivoire. Then we have Isabelle Adam, who's responsible for corporate relations at Touton Group, who's joining us from France today. Then we have Peter Antwi, who's the Assistant Director and Focal Person on Child Labour from the Ministry of Employment and Labour Relations in Ghana. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Marine Jouvin from the University of Bordeaux, who's also joining us from France today. So welcome to you all. It's really great to have you with us, and welcome to all of you who are joining us in the audience. I'm going to start this session by giving some very quick background to explain why we've organised it and what we're hoping to achieve today. So first, what do we mean by the term child labour severity? When we say child labour severity, what we actually mean is the links between child labour and the harm that it causes to children. Child labour is by definition harmful, as you all know, but children can be differently exposed to harm because of the work they do, but also because of the environment around them. Let me give you an example. Let's think about two children. Both of them are 10 years old, both of them are girls, and both of them are living in cocoa-growing communities. The first child's called Amma. She lives with her parents and attends school every day during term time. Her parents are supportive, they help with her homework. In July, during the holidays, Amma worked for 1 hour on the family farm. She used a sharp tool to open cocoa pods. The second child is called Mariam. She lives with her uncle, who's sick and often needs help. Every morning, she fetches water for the household, which she carries in a large jerry can on her head. She then goes to the cocoa farm with her older brothers, where she works for several hours, helping to cut weeds and to grate cocoa pods and to clear forest, depending on the season. She doesn't go to school. Both Amma and Mariam meet the definition of children in the worst forms of child labour. Both have a right to be protected from harmful work, but we can really clearly see from these examples that one child is more likely to be harmed than the other. So at ICI, we want to understand this better. Why? Briefly, because we think that understanding how child labour harms children and in what ways we can better protect children from harm. So the aim of this panel is twofold. We want to share with you, firstly, what we've learned so far about how child labour can harm children's health, development, education, future opportunities, and earnings. And the evidence that we're going to share with you this afternoon is based on a systematic review of available literature, which Marine will present in a moment. Then I want to put these findings in context, and we'll discuss the implications for the cocoa sector, hearing perspectives and reactions from our panelists. So in addition to the great speakers we have on the panel, we'd also like to hear from you, our audience. So after the first presentation, we'll give a few minutes for clarification questions, and Katie's moderating the chat, so thank you for that. So if you can write your questions in the question section, that makes it easier for everybody. And then while we've got some specific questions that I'm going to ask our panelists, you can also ask your questions too. So please also provide your questions through the questions function for that. So Marine, over to you. Based on the literature review that you conducted, commissioned by ICI, what can we learn from the evidence about child labour and harm? And how does child labour impact children's health, development, and education?
Okay, thank you, Megan. So I'm very pleased to present you the findings of this review. Just as Megan just said, it's a literature review about the consequences of child work on education and health. I was commissioned by ICI to do this work with a colleague of mine from the Bordeaux School of Economics, Delphine Boutin. So this review, the main goals of this review were first to identify scientific causal evidence on how child labor might impact children's development, education, and health. And we also wanted to explain the many and often contradictory mechanisms that are at play between education, health, and child work. So this review focuses mainly on scientific evidence coming from rural areas in developing countries. Why? Well, because once again, this review has been commissioned by ICI, which is very interested in knowing a little bit more about the consequences of child work in the sector, in the cocoa sector, and in the more broadly farming sector. So we really wanted to include in this very particular review only studies that could be relevant to this farming sector. So we only added one or two studies that were coming from developed countries, such as Portugal, but only when we thought that the mechanisms or consequences that were highlighted in it were somewhat relevant to the context of farming sector in developing countries. So this review consists of 35 causal studies, which means that these studies are using a very strong enough empirical methodology to identify a real causal relationship and not just a correlation between child work, education, and health. This is quite important as I think that we all have in mind some correlation about the relation between child labor, education, health, and so on. So we only wanted to include in the study strong causal studies that can allow us to say that in that case, child labor has this particular impact on education, for instance. Of course, all of the studies that we have included in this review are coming from peer-reviewed journals, from the economics, health, sociology, and psychology literatures. This review focuses not on child labor, but on child work. At first, it was the plan to focus on child labor, but we quickly understood that it wasn't going to be possible, mainly because the scientific evidence that we have shown weren't providing us enough information about the different types of child labor. We doesn't have any information in those scientific papers about whether this is light work, heavy work, hazardous work, and so on. So we cannot say that in this paper, this is child labor, and in this paper, this is about child work. So I'm just going to talk during this presentation about child work, as this is more right. So let me present you the main findings of this review. The findings of the selected studies are somewhat validating the idea that there is indeed a type of child work that doesn't have any negative consequences for the child, which is in line with the International Labour Organization's visions, according to which there is child work, which is okay in the sense that it doesn't have any adverse effect on the child. And there is child labor, which is completely different and that we want to reduce. And child labor does have some negative consequences for the child. So we have several studies in our review that show that under 10 to 15 hours of work per week, there is actually no significant evidence of the existence of any negative consequences for the child for education. So such as school attendance or the number of years of education a child gets. The intensity of work also matters. Our selected papers are strongly indicating that the longer a child is working, the greater the likelihood that he is going to experience some harm from his work. So in our selected papers, we have some evidence that say that, for instance, the number of work-related injuries and illnesses are increasing with the number of hours worked per week. And that beginning, so we have this evidence, and we have also the evidence that the children that are working long hours are also having a lower school attainment. So in addition with the work intensity, we can also say that it is very important to consider the total amount of work a child gets, the total workload of a child. We have evidence saying that a child that is involved in more than one type of work is going to be more at risk for any harm than a child that is only involved in one type of work. So, for instance, if a child is working in the farming sector, we also want to know whether or not he is doing anything else. For instance, it can be domestic chores. And if it does, then the fact that he's working in two different types of work is increasing the likelihood that he will suffer from harm in the context of his work. When it comes to child work, it also seems that all children are not equal. So we found that younger children, the ones that are aged under 12 years old, are more at risk for harm than any older working children. There is several ways to explain this, but this is very simple. For instance, a young working child may be experiencing more difficulties in combining work and school due to a greater fatigue effect linked to the fact that he is working. The same way, a young working child maybe is way more likely to be less strong and less experienced than any other older working child. So in that case, he will be more at risk for work-related injuries or illnesses. So in the papers that we have selected for this review, we can see that younger children have worse academic performance than others, and that the children that are beginning to work very early, before the age of 14 years old, they see their likelihood of developing depression, for instance, in adulthood more high than any other children. So it also seems that harm is cumulative, which means that the potential negative consequences of child work is going to accumulate over years, over time. So it tells us that this is not a linear relationship, this is not a linear phenomenon. For instance, empirical evidence shows us that the academic delay that is going to be accumulated by a working child during his first year of work is going to be added to the academic delay that the child is going to accumulate during his second year, and so on. And so studies tell us that it is in fact very complicated for a working child that is behind in class or in school to eventually catch up later. And we can have kind of the same mechanism when it comes to being elsewhere, because one can imagine that a child that is working during his childhood is going to experience various work-related injuries. And so, it's going to be more at risk for developing that. For instance, chronic disease or chronic pain once he's going to be an adult. So it really seems that impairments accumulate over time and have adverse effect on the child education outcomes or his health once he's become an adult. Finally, I want that people keep in mind that there are some types of harm that cannot be visible, at least in the short run. So we know that there is evidence that are showing us that child work is associated with lower wages or lower skilled jobs when the child gets older. We also know that child work is increasing, as I just told you, the risk of depression or the risk of a bad health status once the child becomes older and becomes an adult. So when we look at the impact of child work at the short run, and that we cannot find any significant evidence that there is a negative effect of child work on education or health, we must keep in mind that it is true for now, but maybe in 10 years later or later, this exact same child might be experiencing some harm that are directly linked to the fact that he was working as a child. So while doing this review, we identified a lot of gaps in the scientific evidence. First, we have no information about the different impacts of the different tasks and their intensity and their accumulation on education or health. The same way, there is no distinction being made in the scientific evidence, in the scientific papers, between the different types of work. So this is what I was talking about in the introduction part. We don't know in the papers if we are talking about light work, hazardous work, heavy work. And the same way, there is no distinction being made between the sectors of activity in which the child is working. So, for instance, we do not have any paper that is only focusing on the impact of child work in the manufacturing sector on education, for instance. And we do not have any study that only focuses on the adverse effect of child work in the farming sector on education. We only have global studies, so we only have global findings, and we do not have enough details and information to go a little bit further. So then we have another main gap, which is that we have only few significant findings for girls in the studies that we have included in this review, but also in any other study. This is mainly due to the fact that in these papers, the sample size used for the analysis for girls are way more smaller than for boys. And so the researchers cannot draw any conclusive and significant findings for the girls. So this is another major gap. Then we have, it seems that some outcomes are being neglected or overlooked. We have no information or almost no information about the consequences of child work on child development, non-cognitive skills, or school dropouts. And finally, we also have no information about the ability of some what we could call protective factors, such as school, family, or community, to mitigate the harm that the child could be experiencing because of his work. So what this review tells us, however, is that early intervention is key to prevent children from suffering from harm related to their work during a long period of time. It seems also very important to target the younger children and those who are working the most, as they are the most at risk of experiencing some harm. It also seems a good idea to put in place any action that aim at reducing child work time to help them mitigate potential of harm of their work. I think that we can all agree that there are several types of child work, potentially leading to different types of consequences for the child. And so it seems that this is a good idea to have a holistic view of child outcomes to better understand and address progress when we are putting in place some policies aiming at reducing either child work or the negative consequences that can be related to child work. So I will end my presentation just by saying that, of course, I think that the reduction of child work or the reduction of the harm associated with child work should remain a development priority. It seems that it's even today, it's even more important to prevent the intergenerational transmission of poverty, which is very likely when a child begins to work very young, even more in farming sector or subsistence farming, it's even worse. One should keep in mind also that child work has very negative consequences for the child in terms of health in the short run, but also in the long run. So it's also an issue for the public health sector. And of course, trying to reduce child labor is also a great way to giving more opportunities to the former working child to learn more skills, to get a little bit, to have a little bit more education and so on. And so maybe he will be able to not stay stuck in the sector in which he was working when he was a child. So this is also a good opportunity to increase economic productivity in the future for the child. And that's it. And thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much, Marine, for that very thorough review. Of course, that was only a snapshot of the many findings that you came up with by looking in really a great deal of detail through a lot of studies. So thank you very much for presenting them so clearly. I'd like to open the floor briefly to any clarification questions, but I don't see anything for now in the chat. So maybe it's a good time, if we don't have any right now, to go straight to our panelists. So I'd like to start with Bernard and asking you, as a cocoa farmer, why, in your opinion, is it important to understand the link between child labor and harm? And how could this be useful for people like you who live in cocoa growing communities?
Thank you, Megan. For the explanation given, I've seen that the child labor and as a harm it is to our children, I find it important, to my opinion, that we are working for our children. So if our work will lead our children to death, will lead them to made impairment or disability, I don't see the importance why we are working for them. So what, because of them we are toiling, then we should consider their future and see to how we can protect them at their young stage now. And when they grow, they also can also live a good life. And to her explanation does not telling us that we should not train our children to learn, but we need to help us to know the different kind of work they can involve in. And even to that, we need to also supervise them. And while they are doing the light work, they are learning and they will acquire a lot of skills and become responsible adults when they grow, rather than affecting them or taking to the work that is above their weight and their strength and can lead them to harm them negatively. So I think as a cocoa farmer and working in the cocoa area, it will be helpful that we stop all kind of activities that are harmful into the health of our children presently and future. Therefore, we can have them when they grow. they also come assist us in our aged town.
Thanks very much, Bernard. And earlier you also mentioned to me how, there's a lot of, often a lack of knowledge about the link between child labour and harm, and how, had you known that certain tasks were dangerous, you wouldn't, for example, have done them yourself or seen children doing them. So I think that's also an important link to take away from that it really has long-term consequences. And the more we know about those consequences, the better we are equipped to make good decisions about what we do in order to protect our children. Because this is what we see in cocoa-growing communities, is that people do want to protect their children, but we need access to the right information to help make those good decisions. I'm going to turn now to Madame Canon, et je vais poser la question en français parce qu'il y avait des problèmes pour la traduction tout à l'heure. Du coup, Madame Canon, pourquoi serait-il important pour vous de mieux comprendre les dommages résultant du travail des enfants? Comment serait-il utile dans le cadre de votre travail avec les producteurs? And I encourage everyone who needs translation for French to use that option. Allez-y, Madame Canon. Madame Canon, on ne vous entend pas pour l'instant. C'est toujours en silencieux. Toujours pas. Vous pouvez allumer le micro? On va donner un instant à Madame Canon we're going to leave a moment to Madame Canon to sort out her microphone issue. And then I'm going to pass straight to Isabel, if that's all right, Isabel. So turning from the extension services momentarily.
Voilà.
On a Madame Canon. Allez-y, Madame Canon.
Oui, je peux intervenir. D'accord. Pour moi, pour notre point de vue, le thème travail des enfants désigne généralement les activités qui privent les enfants de leur enfance, de leur potentiel et de leur dignité et nuisent à leur développement physique et mental. Il fait référence à des travaux dangereux pour la santé, pour le développement physique, social et moral des enfants. Il interfère dans leur scolarité en privant de la possibilité d'aller à l'école, en les contraignant à abandonner prématurément l'école.
Ça a coupé?
Amener comment orienter les actions de lutte contre le travail des enfants. Cela permettra de comprendre aussi quels sont les travaux dangereux les plus fréquemment réalisés par les enfants, quel est le temps de travail approprié à un enfant selon son âge et déterminer les solutions et soit soustraire les enfants de ce travail-là ou agir sur la source du danger et réduire aussi le temps de travail afin que ces enfants soient protégés. Pour nous aussi, comprendre la sévérité du travail des enfants, c'est également identifier les outils à mettre en œuvre en matière de santé, de sécurité au travail et soustraire l'enfant de cette sévérité, de substituer cette sévérité ou l'atténuer. Aussi, les outils doivent être adaptés à la condition économique et sociale des producteurs au bas de la chaîne d'approvisionnement du cacao.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Canon. And it's really important, and we'll talk more about these interventions in relation to health and safety at work and the role that they can have on protecting children and improving well-being more broadly in cocoa-growing communities. Now I'm going to turn to you, Isabel, and ask why, from your perspective, it's important to be thinking about child labour severity and the links between child labour and harm, and how, particularly from an industry perspective, this idea could be useful for you.
Great. Thanks, Megan, and thanks to ICI and WCF for allowing us the opportunity to offer different perspectives on this panel. So why is it important for cocoa and chocolate companies to better understand child labour severity? The short answer is that it helps inform our prevention and remediation activities on the ground. Because evidence-based research is key to understanding the complex nature of the effects of child labour on children, not only in the short term, but also over time. So what this research shows us is how important it is to take into account the cumulative effect of activities a child may be asked to perform, be it on the farm, but also at household level, and how the combination of these tasks may affect a child's well-being in future. Hopefully, it allows us also to develop more age and gender smart interventions. And in other words, having these additional insights allows us to better target interventions and programs, importantly as they relate to child labour prevention from a child's early age. I believe they're also key to working hand in hand with local, regional, and national structures to ensure the right social safety nets are in place to offer remediation to children when cases are identified. I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. You raised some really good points there. I'm going to turn now to Peter, who has been working on and will probably tell us about in a bit more detail later, a revision to the National Hazardous Activity Framework for Ghana, which really does define which tasks and under what conditions we should consider something to be hazardous child labour. So Peter, to start with, from your perspective, why is it important to better understand the link between child labour and harm? And how is this concept of child labour severity useful in your work as part of the Ministry for Employment and Labour Relations?
Yes. As my other panelists have indicated, from the government perspective, we believe that our understanding and appreciation of the detrimental nature of child labor will inform the government's efforts, our commitment, and then how we will tackle child labor in its totality. Indeed, if you consider child labor as a mere engagement, that will determine that you're going to address child labor in that manner. However, if we consider it as being a detrimental on the physical, psychological well-being, it causes injuries, pain, hurt, suffering, anguish, distress, trauma to children, and that most of them are prevented or from enjoying their fundamental rights as children. They do not attend school. It takes them away from the social environment. They are being exploited. They don't have any protection. They are being tortured, and even where they work, they are invisible. You can't even see where they are. We also know that they don't have access to education and even apprenticeship. This limits their opportunity to transition into any form of decent job in the future. And the country also appreciates the fact that through this meaning act, it is losing great human resource because most of them are going through some permanent deformity, some are dying, and some are just not acquiring the basic skills. Then this will inform government on the level of policies, level of plans, level of effort you should commit in fighting child labor. Government is in order to understand this link that child labor, the harmful effects are very detrimental, and knowing it will now inform how you come together, lead with all partners to address this in a holistic manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I can see we have a couple of questions coming in on the chat, so many thanks for those questions. I'm going to turn back to our panelists and ask you in a bit more detail in relation to your work. Again, Bernard, I'm going to turn to you, and I'd like to ask you, how could a better understanding of harm be used to change perceptions about harm in co-grown communities? So what could be the link to, for example, awareness raising?
Thank you once again for giving this opportunity and how better understand this concept. As a mere farmer or as a farmer, the misconception about this child labor was so highly to the point that farmers, we don't take it a lighter note, whereby we will be engaging that our children should not be in our work. But for us, as you have been with us a while, and other partners, NGOs, who also create awareness and give an education about child labor and harm that it brings. As I said, of the member of the Community Child Protection Committee, we create awareness and education and workshop giving to us that the fact that the children need to work, there is a types of work that children need to involve in. And we need to consider so many factors before we also engage them in. So while we understand this, as I was saying, our parents train us in such a way that they think if they don't take us to their way, we'll be lazy. But as now we are experiencing a lot of sickness within. And this is the consequences of what we engage in earlier in our childhood or early child stages. So now, as we have seen all these things, and that's the consequences, it will be painful for us engaging our children in that. So we have agreed permanently as a farmers now that our children, we need to love them. And when we love our children, we shouldn't harm them. We will not let them engage in activities that will make them disabled, that will give them illness, and that will be a poison to them. So while we love them, we need to seek into their interests. What is their interest? They are responsible to become responsible in future and how they also can live a good life. So I hope as now we are in this crisis, farmers, we agree that we don't want the cycle of poverty continuing in our society. So we are limiting it, therefore we should know the link between the harm that our children are going in is through the child labor. When I force my child to be with me in burning my farmlands, falling down of my trees, the experience I have, the child don't have it. In case any emergency or danger coming, I can escape from it, but the child have no any experience to run away from it. And it can kill the child and harm the child. So while I'm toiling for him, where is it, as I said earlier? So I hope that now we are farmers, we are really ready that we'll let our children get better education, as my colleague Encho was saying. Therefore, the future, they also can engage in a very good work and do the farming very properly than as we are doing it, where our life are engineered. So I hope now, as I'm speaking in the point of a farmer, where child labor and its harm is so much general, but for currently, it has reduced, and we are going to continue on create awareness to our people. As a member of the committee, I hope that we'll continue to educate our people to stop it, and they will really stop it as they see the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And it's really important to highlight the work of local community-based committees, exactly like the work that you do in your community, which not only is helping raise awareness about the dangers and risks associated with child labour, but also about promoting a lot of other child rights, including the importance, for example, of education. And I think just as Arti mentioned so well in her speech earlier today, child rights are obviously a much bigger issue than only child labour alone. And I think looking at severity is a really good way to be able to take this more holistic view and understand the benefits for children of all sorts of interventions, as well as the potential harms from the challenges that exist today. So thank you for that, Bernard. Madame Canon, and I'm going to speak in French again. Comment peuvent les activités pour promouvoir la sécurité et santé au travail avoir un impact positif sur la réduction du travail des enfants et aussi un impact positif sur le bien-être des familles, dans votre expérience?
Oui, Et dans notre expérience chez nous à la NADER en Côte d'Ivoire, la promotion de la santé et la sécurité au travail se fait à travers l'approche WINS qui est développée par l'OIT que nous mettons en œuvre en collaboration avec le BIT à travers le projet Axel Africa. C'est une approche qui est basée sur 4 modules qui sont le stockage et la manutention des matériels, l'aménagement des postes de travail et des outils à main, le milieu de travail et contrôle de substances dangereuses. Et aussi, on a l'installation de bien-être et la coopération communautaire. Cette approche permet de réduire la pénibilité et la dangerosité du travail et d'améliorer la productivité. Concrètement, par exemple, sur la liste des travaux dangereux identifiés en Côte d'Ivoire, il est interdit le port de charges lourdes à travers les approches en termes de manutention et stockage, qui sont des solutions concrètes qu'on apporte aux producteurs et les membres de leur ménage pour le port de charges lourdes dans des conteneurs mini de poignées solides et l'aménagement des supports mobiles pour le transport de charges lourdes. Aussi, le cabossage à la machette est une tâche dangereuse pour les producteurs et on a troqué cela avec un outil appelé cabosseur qui est réalisable par des artisans locaux à un prix acceptable et qui n'est pas dangereux pour les producteurs. L'amélioration de la santé et la sécurité au travail aussi se fait à la maison, notamment par une meilleure gestion des déchets toxiques issus de la fumée de bois, en confectionnant les foyers améliorés à cheminée pour éviter l'exposition des femmes à la fumée de bois. Et aussi, on a les acteurs ruraux qui ont initié une gestion communautaire des déchets agrochimiques à travers des cimetières de produits chimiques pour une meilleure gestion des emballages des produits agrochimiques dans la communauté. Et nous encourageons aussi les échanges des idées entre les producteurs pour accroître la productivité et puis renforcer le travail d'équipe afin de réduire le temps de travail. Il faut dire aussi que cette approche se base sur les améliorations simples, peu coûteuses et par des solutions qui peuvent être trouvées localement dans le milieu de vie des populations. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Canon. And there, I mean, you mentioned quite a few points, which I think are really key as part of this. One is about a very exciting project, which is really looking at reducing risks for adults, but about their knock-on effects then on children. You know, if one of the common reasons for children working is because their parents aren't able to do work that's needed, and then the child comes to replace a parent. So if we're able to reduce, for example, injuries of adults and promote their health and safety, then that can have knock-on effects for children. I think you also made a really important link there between, of course, the harm that comes from several areas of life, for example, cooking, and the inhalation of fumes related to cooking is, of course, not something that's specifically related to the cocoa sector. But if we take a more holistic view, and if we're thinking about children's rights in a more holistic way, then it's really important to take this into account as well, and take into account that potential harm, and think also in holistic ways about the sorts of measures we can take to reduce that harm. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn now back to Isabel. And I want to look at one particular point that emerged from that literature review, which was about the earlier a child starts working, the greater the potential for harm. Do you think you could tell us a bit more about how early interventions and the kinds of interventions that Maureen mentioned in her presentation could be better incorporated by industry?
Thanks, Megan. So I'll try to do that, to respond in terms of what can be done in terms of early childhood development interventions. And hopefully I'll also be bouncing back on some of the things that Bernard Coffey and Madame Canon have already started evoking. So in terms of industry efforts, obviously we continue to refine our systems to identify and remediate child labor, notably with the support of ICI and other implementing partners that help us to develop and deploy the tools to increase efficiency and impact. But importantly, more and more companies are engaging in programs that address, as I was saying, early childhood development. So this can range from programs that raise awareness on nutrition and access to health and quality education, which are obviously key to a child's well-being and to his or her psychological and physical development, but also other initiatives such as those developed through the TREC program in Côte d'Ivoire that focus, for instance, on parental skill training. But beyond this, we continue to work on the underlying causes of child labor. And so these may touch upon early childhood development, but also, as Madame Canon was mentioning, Madame Canon, sorry, things that also, are targeted towards parents, but that have a knock-on effect on children's well-being. So if we look at the underlying causes of child labor, so namely poverty, that often translates into lack of available income to cover educational or health costs, or to actually hire skilled laborers for farm work, which would avoid reverting to child labor. So in addition to supporting farmers in respect to improving cocoa yield, quality, and income, we are supporting households and communities in developing alternative income streams through diversification of crops, or the setup of micro-enterprises under the umbrella, let's say, of village savings and loans associations. But we know also that access to skilled labor in cocoa growing communities can be challenging. So that's why we're also working with implementing partners and national extension services to train service providers to perform some of the more time and resource intensive activities in farm labor at farm level, which in addition creates employment opportunities for young adults. So community level interventions, for instance, those covering access to potable water through the construction of boreholes or access to renewable energy outlets, also help to tackle the need to travel long distances carrying heavy loads, also something that unfortunately children often need to engage in. I'd like to stress, and this comes back to what Bernard was saying earlier, that these activities are all the more likely to succeed and be sustainable over time when they are developed in collaboration with cocoa communities themselves through inclusive and participatory consultations. So really building on identification of needs as expressed by the communities themselves. Going on to education and the huge link between risk of child labor and access to quality education. Many WCF companies have also signed up to the CLEF initiative, which was kickstarted by the Jacobs Foundation and brings together the authorities of Côte d'Ivoire, key philanthropic actors and private sector companies with the ambition of greatly improving access to quality education at scale in Côte d'Ivoire. It builds on evidence-based heat maps, and to echo a point made by Martin Short in his opening address, this initiative is particularly laudable because it is all about pooling resources and know-how and builds on contribution rather than on attribution. ICI is also developing other exciting innovations and pilots, for instance, on conditional and unconditional cash transfers to boost household income or to address child protection efforts at landscape level. There's also, and this is something I'm particularly enthusiastic about, a growing appetite to look at environmental and socioeconomic issues at landscape level, which I believe holds great promise given that both child labor and deforestation have common root causes and cannot be addressed solely by one supply chain. So I think, if we take a step back and look at all the great work that has been done, that is undergoing now, I think we're all getting better at connecting the dots and working in partnership. Because ultimately, our aim should be that the overall impact of what we are doing on the ground goes far beyond the sum of individual activities and programs.
Thanks very much for that, Isabel. And you're echoing a message which I feel like will continue to emerge over the next 2 days in relation to collaboration and the importance of working together on these topics so that that more holistic view can actually be achieved. So thank you for that. I can see a couple more questions coming in, which is great. I'm going to ask one first to Peter, which is specifically about your work on the revision of Ghana's National Hazardous Activity Framework. Could you tell us a bit more about how that revision takes into account the links between child labour and harm to children?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I cannot put on my video now. I must indicate that the Constitution of Ghana specifically prescribes child labor. And if I want to be specific, Article 28(2) says every child has the right to be protected from engaging in work that constitute a threat to his health, education, and development. And 28.3 says that a child shall not be subjected to a torture or other cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment. Ghana has also ratified the ILO Convention 182 on the worst form of child labor. And in accordance with Article 4.1, Ghana, in consultation with the tripartite constituents, developed the Hazardous Activity Framework. The process was very consultative with all relevant stakeholders, and it was very specific that when we first identify job areas where there are inherent hazards that can hurt children. So what we do is you take the job and identify all the tasks in them and identify the hazards and the harms that are associated with each of the steps. In that case, you are able to know which one is very hazardous or injurious to the health of the child. And then which one is not. In doing so, you're able to categorize the work into those that are hazardous, that children are not permitted to do at all, and those that are not hazardous, which 15 to 17-year children can be engaged in, but under protection of an adult, either parent or a guardian. This was developed in 2012. The cocoa we first had one for the cocoa sector, which was in 2008. So barely about 10 years on, we all agree that there has been changes in the world of work. There has been technological advancement. How you used to do work has changed. New things have come in, new forms of hazards, new forms of harm has come into the job processes. So government is going back to the hazardous list that was developed about 10 years ago, again to consult the players in the field, cocoa farmers, fishermen, those who are engaged in all these activities, to sit down with them that now let's identify what are some of the new approaches that have come in the course of engaging in your activities. What are the inherent health? Which ones can we allow children to engage in? Which ones should we not allow children to engage in? So this is the process the government is currently going through. And yesterday, we had a validation meeting where we brought in experts from various fields. Some are occupational safety and health personnel who came in to discuss some of the revision that has been done, to discuss the process, to know that no, these are the harms in them. We cannot allow children to engage in this. If you do that, it's going to either hurt them, they are going to have serious injuries, they're going to go through some psychological trauma. We cannot engage them in this and that. So that is the process government is going through. We're also looking at other areas that were not considered in the first list that was done, so that we can bring them on board to ensure the total protection of children in Ghana. So in a nutshell, this is what government is doing to further strengthen the protection of children from all forms of hazards, so that we can have very strong labor force for the development of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And having seen the document, I can really echo what a thorough process, or the draft document, I should say, what a thorough process this has been in terms of not only looking very, very closely at what the activities are, what conditions those activities could be classed as hazardous or not hazardous, but also involving the participation, as requested by Isabel, of communities, of children, and taking their views into account as a way of defining something that makes sense, offers the necessary protections, but also somehow remains relevant to the context of Ghana, which is what it's intended for. So thank you very much for that update, Peter. I think maybe now would be a good time to turn to some of the questions from the floor. There's a first question I can see from Neil Barston, and it's for you, Marine. he asks, did your study look at any of the levels of child labor in Côte d'Ivoire or in Ghana in particular?
Actually, no, because it wasn't any study focusing on causal study, I mean, focusing on the consequences of child labor on education or health in Ivory Coast, neither in Ghana. We only have papers that were more like qualitative paper or that just allow us to establish the correlation between child labor, education, or health. So no.
Thanks for clarifying that, Marine. And I mean, it really underlines how complicated it is that there was so little really robust causal evidence available. So we did have to spread the net a bit wider in terms of what we included and what we excluded. But nonetheless, as much as possible, the examples that are in that paper are really drawn from agriculture in rural areas. So contexts that are somehow comparable to cocoa growing communities, even if it wasn't necessarily cocoa and the kinds of work that's done in cocoa that children were doing. I've got another question here, and I'm afraid I don't know who it's from, but it says, if we view child labor as a public health issue, what could we learn from other public health frameworks? For example, what could we learn from HIV/AIDS about shifting the focus from the disease to the cure? I think to some extent this touches a bit on what you were mentioning, Isabel. Would you like to have a go at responding?
I'll give it a first try, but I'm sure others will be able to add. I think it's the way you go about addressing some of these topics that are quite sensitive and not always where social norms or different perceptions or understanding can lead to different interpretations of why something may be seen as harmful or not. Means that many interventions we see as being more effective look at solutions rather than the problem. So instead of focusing on the stigma of the why it's not acceptable, it's really looking more at the solutions. To what Bernard was saying, for instance, it's more and you know, interventions like the one I mentioned on parental skilling. It's empowering people to make the right decisions for themselves, but for their children. So really putting them giving them the capacity to do so, rather than being on the defensive and trying to respond to what they see as something that is imposed upon them. So empowering and working with the communities is key. So trying to address the solution instead of just focusing on the problem, if that makes any sense.
It does to me. Thank you, Isabel. Bernard, I wonder if you want to add anything to the comment of Isabel, which is really about, might it be easier to promote positive actions that you can do rather than, if I interpret it a little bit, rather than forbidding or always putting the focus on negative things that you shouldn't do? Bernard?
Yes, please. As Ms. Isabella was saying, but it depends on the consequences coming out is what we are looking at. So as a farmer, for understanding the contents now, whatever I'm doing, I consider the consequences. The consequences will make it positive or negative. Without it, I can't classify it to any group of anything. But the moment the consequences, what I have experienced, what I train with and what I've experienced during the train to today in my life will let me know that what we are getting in is so going to affect the children's life. So for now, we'll deeply look at the consequences, and this is the better understanding of it. The moment you know the consequences, you advise yourself whether you engage your word or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. That was great. I wonder if Madame Canon or Peter, you would like to add anything? Maybe not. Okay, in which case I can... Oh, Madame Canon, vous voulez rajouter quelque chose?
Oui. Non, ça va.
No? Okay, great.
Oui, ça va. Merci.
I can see another question here. which is again directed to Marine. And it says, to what extent did the study look at harm through malnutrition in comparison with harm from child labor? If so, what are the findings? Harm from child labor is obviously one of many different harms that children are exposed to. And I think that question was from Kunera Moore. Thanks, Kunera.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was saying, did you look at harm to children caused by other things aside from child labor? For example, malnutrition, which of course can also be a problem in rural agricultural communities.
So no, because this literature review was really about the consequences of child labor. So we have been focused on finding relevant studies about the harm caused by the child work. So no, but indeed it's a very interesting topic. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Marine. And maybe to add to that answer, as Marine mentioned in her presentation, there are quite a lot of gaps in the literature because there have been not that many studies done specifically to understand the impact of child work on different child outcomes. However, I think it's really important that we put those findings in a slightly broader context because, for example, while there were, I think, no studies specifically looking at the impact on child non-cognitive development as a result of child labor, there are an awful lot of similarities that we can use from the literature on child development about, for example, the effects of stress and abuse and other forms of what we call adverse impact to the development of a child. And I think if we take a step back from the initial literature that we've looked at, it's really useful to be able to put those findings in more of a context and to be able to make some of those links between other bodies of literature and other existing evidence. And I think malnutrition is a great example of something that comes into that should be taken into account. And we can definitely consider that an adverse event in the life of a child. And probably there are many similarities. And certainly we know that from child development, the younger that challenge happens, the more likely it is to have a negative impact in the longer term. And the longer time a child is exposed to an adverse event, again, the bigger the impact it has. So I think there are a lot of similarities, and in terms of taking messages from it and saying, what do we do about it? And we can certainly spread the net a bit wider, and we should be taking that into account as we move forward. So great question, thank you. And then I think we have one more question, which is from Acha Atam, who says, did your study look at the monitoring and mediation systems put in place by cocoa companies to fight child labor, about their effectiveness and efficiency? So I can answer that question, which is no. We weren't looking specifically in this study about interventions. We were really looking at challenges that took place. But maybe I can put a question to you, our panelists, in relation to child labor monitoring mediation systems, which exist in many cocoa growing communities, both those organized by the government, those organized by communities, and those organized by cocoa and chocolate companies. Is that how could, do you think, this better understanding of severity and of harm be used in the context of a child labor monitoring mediation system to better provide or to target interventions? I'm going to pass the floor first to Peter, in case you'd like to respond to this. But there's silence. So I'm going to pass it then to Isabel.
Well, I would think that this would definitely help in terms of better identification and risk of child labor. So more for preventive measures. So this would, to me, should strengthen further the CNRMRS systems, but also the capacity for communities through the community child protection committees to also contribute to raising awareness and understanding of let's say, the cumulative harm of these different adverse effects and activities. That's my 2 cents for the time being. Sorry, I hope I've answered the question somewhat.
I think that will do. Thank you. Let me see if there are any more questions coming from the floor right now. Not specifically, I think. So maybe we can wrap up a tiny bit early, or maybe Isabel or anyone else, you have your hand raised as if you want to add something, would like to ask questions to the other participants.
Well, maybe food for thought going forward. I mean, obviously, this is important research, and it had a specific focus, as any research or study should have. But I think as we move further in our understanding of the granularity and the complexity of these issues, I think it would be interesting to, and also going back to partnerships and collaboration, maybe to look at the findings of this study and confront them also with studies that exist on nutrition and effects of nutrition and longer term impact on children and their capacity to develop psychologically, physically, etc. And also to blend in, because so much is happening right now. It's an exciting time for the cocoa sector. The CLEAR initiative in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, has this heat map, which is also linked to access to basic services, be it schools, access to health, etc. And I think it's interesting to see how, it would be interesting to see how the cumulative effect of all these insights we now have can be used. We can kind of look at the intersections between these different things. So to what extent the likelihood of harm or the length of activities, etc., can also be viewed through that lens of a heat map with the kind of infrastructure and access to different services. I think that would also be another dimension that would help in the smart mix of interventions and programs. So I'm not sure it's a question, but it's a comment.
I don't think it's quite a question, but it's a very interesting thought and a great one to leave us with. And I think it also touches on something that Marine mentioned a little bit as a gap, but of course is something that does exist, and maybe something that came up from the two examples I shared at the beginning of this session. On the one hand, there are activities and situations that can give children a greater harm, a greater chance of being harmed, but there are also situations that can protect children from that harm, and to better understand how to mitigate the potential negative effects of challenging situations, including being involved in child labour, are also really important. So being able to pull that evidence, as you say, about the positive impacts of lots of different types of intervention, both to prevent children from being harmed, but also to remediate the harm that they may have already sustained as a result of, for example, the work they did. And I think both of those things are really important to take into account going forward. I'm going to finish firstly by thanking all of you, the participants who've posed some great questions, and particularly our panelists who've joined us from many different corners of the world. Thank you so much for sharing your insights as part of this session. It's really great to have you. I think looking at these perspectives that come from people based in and working in cocoa growing communities like Madame Canon and like Bernard, people involved at a different level of the industry like Isabel, from government, and also from the academic perspective, there are several clear and practical advantages to better understanding this idea of the link between child labour and harm and the severity, and also its overall impact for children more broadly. And I think, this really shows that there are potential advantages to learning more about it, but also to using what we learn in a practical way. So maybe from ICI's side, we have some practical next steps of what we're going to do. This work only started this year, although we've been talking about it for a while. First, we're going to publish the report that Marine has been working on for us, together with some more broader messages about what this implications might be for the cocoa sector and where we think it needs to go. Then we're going to use it to develop an operational concept of child labour severity that can really be used to help measure and understand children's exposure to harm and their vulnerability related to that. And then the plan is to develop some practical tools that can be used in the cocoa sector, first of all, to better identify which children are at the greatest risk of harm so that we can make sure that they're prioritised for support. Working on understanding the impact of interventions to prevent harm from occurring by acting early. So things like looking at the impact of positive parenting interventions and early childhood development, as is happening in the context of the CLEAR initiative, is great. And finally, we hope that these tools will also help us measure the impact of the work that we do in a more nuanced way. So not only should we be asking, does this reduce child labour, but we should also be asking, does this prevent and reduce harm? And ultimately, does this improve child well-being more broadly? So thank you all for joining us this afternoon and this morning for those of you in a different time zone, and enjoy the rest of the meeting.